Revenge with Ava. I used to believe corporate cruelty was just part of the cost of a paycheck, something you swallowed with burnt coffee and a forced smile. But the night my CEO, Graham Kessler, leaned over my desk and hissed, "Refuel my chopper, tech," like I was a disposable tool instead of the operations analyst, who kept his entire travel grid from collapsing, something inside me went cold and quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't break, it sharpens. The helipad sat on the roof of Kessler Aerodyne's headquarters like a crown, and Graham treated it like a stage where he could remind everyone who owned the sky, who owned the building, who owned the people inside it. And on that particular evening, rain hammered the windows while the quarterly close screamed red across every dashboard. Yet he still needed his dramatic exit. A helicopter, waiting as if the world paused when he snapped his finger's eye, was still new enough to the executive floor to know better than to show anger, but not naive enough to mistake his tone for stress. Because stress doesn't make you smirk while humiliating someone. Stress doesn't make you call my name across the bullpen like a dog whistle, Mara now, while his assistants stared at their screens pretending not to hear, and when I stood, he didn't even look at me, just tossed a slim black folder onto my keyboard and said, "Make it happen," like fuel was a button I could click. I opened the folder and realized it wasn't fuel at all. It was a landing request. Packet for a last-minute VIP arrival at our private pad, requiring clearance signatures, maintenance sign-off, weather confirmation, and a final compliance check. The kind of checklist you don't rush, because if you miss one line, someone gets hurt. Or worse, a regulator gets curious. And curiosity is how empires fall. I said softly, "Sir, I can route this to aviation ops, but clearance requires." And that's when he finally looked at me, eyes flat and pleased, and said, "Your aviation ops tonight." Then he leaned closer so only I could hear him over the storm, and murmured, "Do it wrong and I'll make sure you never work in this city again." And just like that, my stomach tightened, not with fear, but with a decision. I took the packet upstairs to the aviation suite that Graham insisted wasn't a department because departments had budgets and accountability, and what he wanted was a private machine fueled by other people's silence. And there I found the real aviation manager, Darius, pale and sweating, his tie loosened, hands shaking over a phone that wouldn't stop vibrating. He grabbed my wrist like I was a life raft and whispered, "He told you? He told you to handle it?" And when I nodded, Darius's face collapsed into a kind of dread I didn't understand yet, and he whispered, "He's trying to set someone up." But before he could explain, Graham's chief of staff, Leela Park, glided in like a blade, heels quiet on the carpet, smile bright enough to blind, and she said, "Mara, you're a lifesaver." Then she slid a pen into my hand as if she were helping me, and tapped the signature line marked final clearance. I hesitated because the weather feed was unstable and the maintenance stamp wasn't in, and I said, "This isn't complete." But Leela tilted her head and lowered her voice into something almost tender. "You want to be here, right? You want to stay?" And it was such a simple threat, wrapped in silk, that I felt my cheeks burn. Darius stared at me like he was begging me not to do it. But he didn't speak, because men like Graham don't just fire people, they erase them. And the company had already taught everyone that silence was safer than truth. I refused the pen and said, "I'm not authorized." And Lila's smile didn't change. Yet her eyes did, going colder, calculating. And she said, "Then I'll tell him you refused a direct order." And at that exact moment, the storm cracked with a flash of lightning, and in the glass reflection I saw myself, hair pinned back, blouse wrinkled from hours at my desk, badge hanging like a leash, and I realized I'd been living like a careful mouse in a house full of traps. So I did the one thing they never expected. I smiled back, softly, and said, "I'm not refusing. I'm verifying." And I stepped aside, opened our internal compliance portal, and started pulling logs, not because I was brave, But because I was tired of being scared, I had access to systems most people forgot existed. The boring backend that tracked every request, every override, every urgent action that executives claimed was too important for policy. And as I dug, I noticed something that made my skin prickle. This VIP request had been created under my user profile, not Darius's, not Lila's, mine, and the timestamp was from an hour when I'd been in a meeting downstairs. Badge swipe proven, camera proven, impossible. Unless someone had cloned my credentials or used admin access to impersonate me. And the deeper I looked, the worse it got. A pattern of misfiled requests, altered weather reads, rushed maintenance sign-offs, always under disposable employees' names, always close enough to plausibly blame. Someone lower, always benefiting Graham's private travel schedule and the investors he courted like royalty. I swallowed hard and asked Darius, "How long has this been happening?" And he stared at the floor and whispered, long enough that I stopped sleeping. Then he looked up with wet eyes and said, "They already ruined 2 people." And I felt something snap into focus. The reason Leela wanted my signature wasn't because I was needed. It was because I was new, unknown, and easy to sacrifice if anything went wrong tonight. I should have walked away, saved myself. But I thought of my mom's voice telling me, "You don't have to be loud to be strong. You just have to stop cooperating with your own destruction." And I thought of the interns downstairs who still believed. Hard work protected you. And I thought of the kind of world where a man can demand a sky stage while storms rage and people are crushed under him. And I decided I would not be their scapegoat. I told Darius, "Don't sign anything." And I did something I'd never done in my life. I opened my private notes file and started documenting everything, screenshotting logs, copying timestamps, saving audit trails. Because in my line of work, truth only matters if you can prove it. Leela watched me with that fixed smile and said, "Mara, are you okay?" Like she cared, and I said, "I'm great," and kept clicking, and that's when Graham himself appeared in the doorway, coat draped over his shoulders like a cape, hair perfect, eyes sharp as glass. And the room tightened around him. He didn't ask how things were going. He looked at the screens, at me, at Darius, and said, "Why is my clearance not approved?" And I said, "Because the storm rating is above threshold, and maintenance hasn't confirmed the pad lights." And he laughed, a short, cruel sound, and stepped closer until I could smell his expensive cologne cutting through the sterile office air. "You're quoting policy to me," he said. And I kept my face calm, kept my voice even, because fear feeds men like him. And I said, "I'm doing my job." And he leaned in and whispered, "Your job is to do what I say," then louder, "For everyone, Mara's stalling. She's not a team player." And I saw how he performed leadership like theater, turning simple compliance into betrayal, making anyone who resisted look selfish. Leela slid beside him and murmured something in his ear, and his gaze flicked to the final clearance line again. And I understood the trap. If I signed, I owned the risk. If I didn't, I was insubordinate. Either way, they planned to ruin me. So I took a third path. The path they never leave room for. By telling the truth in a way that couldn't be twisted, I turned my monitor slightly so it faced him and said, "Sir?" The request was created under my account while I was off floor. Would you like me to report a credential breach to it and compliance? And for the first time, Graham's smile faltered, just a twitch, but it was real, and Lila's eyes narrowed like a warning. "Don't be dramatic," he said. But his voice was too quick, and I pressed gently. "It's not drama, it's audit." And I watched the room change as that one word landed, audit. Because rich men fear regulators the way ordinary people fear knives. Graham's face hardened, and he said, "Close that screen." And when I didn't, he slapped the edge of my monitor hard enough to rattle it and said, "Lo, you don't want a war." And I met his stare and thought, "You already started it," I said. "I don't want a war." And then, very softly, "I want to keep people alive." And Darius let out a shaky breath, like he'd been underwater too long. Graham straightened, regained his composure, and switched tactics, voice smooth as oil. "Mara, you're talented. You could go far here. Don't ruin this over a checklist." And I almost laughed, because it was always the same pattern. Threaten, belittle, seduce, destroy. I said, "I won't sign." And the silence that followed felt like standing on the edge of a roof. Graham's gaze slid to Leela, and she nodded once, almost imperceptible. And he said, loudly, "Fine. If Mara won't do her job, I'll find someone who will." Then he turned and walked out as if bored, as if my refusal meant nothing, but I saw the fury in the stiffness of his shoulders, and I knew what was coming. Within minutes, my phone buzzed with an email from HR titled "Performance Concern." The kind of message that reads like a polite execution, and then another email, "Access Change Notice," and then I tried to log back into the compliance portal and saw the spinning wheel of denial, my permissions stripped in real time, like someone pulling the floor out from under me. Lila's smile returned full force as she watched me struggle, and she said, "Oh no, looks like your access is glitching." Then she leaned closer and whispered, "This is where you apologize." And my hands shook, not from fear, but from rage, because it was so clean, so practiced, so evil in its simplicity. Darius whispered, "Mara, please, you should go." And I realized he wasn't trying to save Graham. He was trying to save me, because he had seen what happened to the last person who refused. I should have left, but I'd already taken screenshots, already saved evidence to a secure drive I owned outside the company network, because the first rule of surviving powerful liars is never store your truth in their house. I exhaled slowly and said, "I'm going to the helipad." And Darius stared, "Why?" And I said, "Because if he can't fly, he'll force someone else to make it happen." And I ran up the stairwell 2 steps at a time, heels slipping on concrete, heart punching my ribs, while the building hummed with fluorescent calm below, as if nothing was happening. When I reached the roof access door, the wind hit me like a slap, rain cold and needling. The city spread out below like a dark ocean, and the helipad lights blinked in the storm like a warning. The helicopter wasn't there yet, but Graham was, standing under the overhang with 2 security men and the pilot, an older man with tired eyes, who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. Graham's voice carried over the wind, sharp and impatient. "We're going." And the pilot said, "Sir, the gusts are unstable." And Graham snapped, "I pay you to fly." And that sentence, that ugly entitlement, made me step forward without thinking. I called out, "Captain, the weather threshold is exceeded." And Graham turned, surprise flashing into anger. "What are you doing up here?" And I said, loud enough for security to hear, "Preventing an unsafe departure." And Graham laughed like I was entertainment. "You can't stop me." And I said, "Watch me," because I couldn't sign papers anymore, but I could do something better. I could revoke his landing clearance. Our pad wasn't just private, it was regulated, and clearance could be pulled by anyone with the authority code. Authority I'd lost in the system, but not in the physical procedure binder, locked in the rooftop cabinet. Because executives forget paperwork exists until it saves them, I yanked the cabinet open, grabbed the laminated emergency protocol, and held it up in the rain, reading the line that mattered. And then I called the building's on-site safety officer from my personal phone, the one person Graham couldn't fully control, and I said, "Active severe weather. Executive attempting unsafe flight. I'm invoking stop protocol." And the officer's voice went tight, copy, and within seconds, the rooftop loudspeaker chimed, and a calm automated message declared the helipad temporarily closed due to weather. And just like that, Graham's stage vanished, His face went red, eyes burning, and he stalked toward me, close enough that rain sprayed off his shoulders onto my blouse, and he hissed, "You little." But he caught himself, because security was watching and cameras were recording, and I knew he hated that. Being seen, he lowered his voice, "You just ended your career," and I looked at him and felt, strangely, peace, because careers can be rebuilt. But souls don't come back once you trade them for comfort, I said. Then I'll build a better one. And behind him the pilot quietly stepped back like he'd been waiting for someone to give him permission to choose safety. And in that tiny moment, I felt the first spark of something I hadn't felt in months. Hope. Graham turned away like he couldn't bear to look at me and barked at Lila over the phone, "Fix this." And I knew she would try, that they would come for me next, not with fists, but with paperwork. Whispers. Ruined. Reputations, because that's how corporate predators kill. Without leaving blood, I went back downstairs drenched and shaking, and when I reached my desk, my badge no longer worked on the elevator, so I took the stairs, and as I passed the executive lounge, I heard laughter, Graham entertaining his. VIP in the storm, acting like the delay was a charming inconvenience rather than a safety stop, and I realized the VIP was someone from the Aviation Standards Board, a regulator, here on private business, and my pulse spiked, because I understood the deeper game. Graham wasn't just arrogant. He was courting the very people meant to oversee him, bribing them with access, luxury, a seat at his sky throne, and tonight he'd wanted to impress them with a dramatic arrival. And when I stopped it, I didn't just inconvenience him. I embarrassed him in front of someone whose approval mattered. I got to my desk and found a cardboard box sitting there. My box, HR already moving like vultures, and an email popped on my phone from Lila Meeting. Now, bring your badge, and my hands trembled as I held the device, because this was the moment they expected me to break, to cry, to plead, to sign whatever confession they shoved in front of me. But I stared at my reflection in the dark monitor, rain-streaked hair, mascara smudged, eyes brighter than they'd been all year, and I remembered Darius's words, "He's trying to set someone up," and I realized the miracle wasn't that I'd stopped a helicopter. It was that I'd finally stopped cooperating with my own erasure. I picked up my box, walked past the staring faces, and headed for HR, not like a victim, but like a witness, because I had evidence saved where they couldn't reach it, and I knew something else now too. Men like Graham don't lose because someone yells at them. They lose because someone calmly documents their lies and hands the truth to the one force they can't buy. Forever, consequences, and as the elevator doors opened to the HR floor, the fluorescent lights felt like an interrogation room, yet my steps stayed steady, because I wasn't walking into a firing squad. I was walking into the first scene of his downfall, and even in that cold corporate air, I could almost feel karma circling the building like a storm cloud that finally found its address. By the time I sat across from HR, the rain had stopped, but the damage had already soaked in, the kind that doesn't show on clothes but seeps into records and reputations. And the woman from HR, Cynthia, neat bun, careful smile, kept repeating the same phrase like a lullaby meant to put me to sleep. "We're just trying to understand," while a printed report lay between us already labeled incident summary, as if the conclusion had been written before the conversation began. She spoke softly about team alignment and executive confidence, about how my behavior on the helipad could be interpreted as insubordinate, and I listened without interrupting, because I'd learned that people reveal more when they think you're quiet out of fear instead of preparation. And when she finally slid the paper toward me with a pen and said, "This just acknowledges your mistake," I felt that old pressure rise, the instinct to make things easier by agreeing. But I didn't touch the pen. I asked one simple question instead. Why does this document reference a clearance approval I never signed? and the room shifted just a hair, Cynthia's eyes flicking down before she caught herself, and she said, "It's standard language," which was a lie too smooth to be new. I leaned back and said calmly, "Then it should be easy to correct," and she hesitated, and in that hesitation I saw how this worked. Paper cuts, not knives, death by 1,000 polite edits. So I stood up, picked up my box, and said, "I'll have my attorney review it," even though I didn't have one yet. Because sometimes the threat of light is enough to make shadows move. Cynthia's smile froze, and she said, "There's no need to escalate," and I said I didn't escalate anything, and walked out, heart pounding, but spine straight. Because I knew the moment I refused to sign their version of events, I became dangerous to them. Not powerful yet, but unpredictable. And unpredictability scares systems built on control. By the time I reached the lobby, my phone buzzed with messages from coworkers. Some cautious, some panicked, one from Darius that simply said, "I'm sorry," and another from an unknown number, "You embarrassed him." You should have stayed quiet, and I stared at that message for a long time, because it perfectly captured the philosophy that kept men like Graham untouchable. The idea that silence was a moral duty. I left the building with my box under my arm, security watching but not stopping me. Because even they knew the optics of dragging a woman out after a storm were bad, and as the revolving doors spun, I felt both smaller and lighter, unemployed and unburdened, terrified and strangely awake. The next morning, the company email hit my inbox like clockwork, subject, termination notice, citing gross misconduct and failure to follow executive directive, and attached was a severance agreement that would have paid me just enough to disappear quietly in exchange for silence. And for a moment I considered it, not because I believed them, but because I was tired, because fighting costs energy and money and time, because hope is heavy when you're carrying it alone. But then I opened my secure drive and saw the evidence I'd saved, the neat folders of timestamps and logs and impersonation traces, and I remembered Darius's hollow eyes, and the pilot stepping back, and the way. Graham's smile had cracked when I said audit, and I knew this wasn't just about me anymore. I called my mom, not to tell her details, she didn't need the wait, but to hear her voice, and she said, "You sound different," and I said, "I am." And that was the truest thing I'd said all week. I spent the next days doing what I'd never imagined myself doing, meeting with an employment lawyer recommended by a friend of a friend, a woman named Rachel with sharp questions and a laugh that cut through my fear, who listened to my story without interrupting and then said, "They messed up," and when I asked how she could be sure, she tapped my screenshots and said, "Because they're sloppy when they think you're powerless," and that sentence became my anchor. Rachel explained the chessboard to me, how corporations move fast to control narrative, how they isolate you, drain you, hope you'll fold before discovery, and she warned me that retaliation would escalate, that Graham wouldn't let this go quietly because men like him confused dominance with survival. Within a week, the whispers started. Anonymous posts on industry forums questioning my competence, a LinkedIn comment hinting I was unstable, a recruiter canceling a call last minute, and each small cut stung because it threatened the future I'd worked for. But Rachel kept me focused on the long game, telling me, "Let them talk, every lie leaves fingerprints," and we began drafting a formal complaint to regulators. Not emotional, not dramatic, just facts lined up like dominoes waiting for a push. Meanwhile, something unexpected happened. Darius called me from a blocked number, voice shaking, and said, "I can't do this anymore." And when I asked what he meant, he told me he'd been suspended pending review. His access cut, his reputation already bleeding, because Graham had decided to clean house. And I felt that familiar guilt creep in, the lie that says if you just stayed quiet, others wouldn't suffer. But Darius surprised me by saying, Watching you stand up there, it reminded me who I used to be." And he offered to testify, not loudly, not publicly, but truthfully, and I realized courage is contagious. Not because it makes people brave, but because it makes them remember themselves. More voices followed, slow at first, then steadier. A former assistant who'd been forced to alter travel records, a maintenance contractor who'd been pressured to sign off early, an intern who'd been told to fix timestamps and didn't understand why it mattered. And as Rachel collected affidavits, the story grew teeth. Graham responded the way predators do when cornered, by attacking harder, filing a defamation notice against me, leaking to a business blog that I'd been fired for safety paranoia, painting himself as a visionary hampered by small minds. And for a few terrifying days, I watched his version spread faster than the truth, because lies travel light while facts carry weight. But then something shifted when a minor regulator flagged an inquiry, just a request for clarification, just a knock on the door, and I knew enough to understand that regulators move slow on purpose, not because they're weak, but because when they move, they don't miss. Graham tried to buy time, scheduling voluntary audits, donating to safety initiatives, posting smiling photos with pilots and inspectors, and for a moment, I worried it would work, that he'd charm his way out like always. But Rachel reminded me that patterns are louder than performances, and patterns were what we had. The day the Aviation Standards Board formally opened an investigation, my phone lit up with calls from numbers I didn't recognize, including one from Lila, who left a voicemail so syrupy it made my skin crawl, saying, "Mara, let's talk like adults." And when I didn't respond, she sent another message hinting at a settlement, then another warning me not to burn bridges, and I laughed out loud at that. Because bridges that only let one person cross aren't bridges, they're traps. The pressure mounted, and some nights I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if I'd ruined my life. For a principle no one would remember, but every morning I woke with the same quiet certainty. I'd chosen myself, and that choice, once made, couldn't be undone. The investigation pulled threads Graham had hidden well, uncovering a private aviation shell company, undisclosed consulting fees, a cozy web of favors that blurred lines until no one remembered where policy ended and ego began. And as the walls closed in, Graham did the unthinkable. He tried to make me disappear legally by offering a massive settlement tied to a gag order so tight it would have erased not just my voice, but my experience. And for a split second, the number dazzled me. Because money can look like freedom when you're exhausted, but Rachel looked at me and said, "If you take this, he wins twice." And I knew she was right. When I rejected the offer, Graham snapped, firing his legal team and hiring a louder one that tried to paint me as a disgruntled employee with a grudge, and it hurt to see my integrity questioned publicly. But it hurt more to imagine staying silent and letting the next woman be fed to the same machine. The day Darius officially testified, he called me afterward and said, "I slept last night, and that was worth more than any settlement. Then came the hearing, closed door, procedural, nothing like the courtroom dramas on TV, just rooms full of tired people asking precise questions, and I answered each one with the same calm truth, letting the documents speak. Because truth doesn't need decoration. Graham wasn't in the room when I testified, but I could feel his presence like a pressure change, and later I learned he'd been advised not to attend because his temper was a liability, which felt like a small, delicious irony. Weeks passed, then months, and the waiting was the hardest part, because life doesn't pause for justice. You still need to pay rent, still need to apply for jobs that quietly disappear once your name is complicated, still need to smile at friends who don't know what to say. But through it all, something inside me stayed solid, like a bone that had finally set. One afternoon, Rachel called me with a tone I hadn't heard before, light, almost amused, and said, "You might want to sit down." And when she told me the preliminary findings, that the board had identified systemic noncompliance and intentional misrepresentation, my knees went weak, not with triumph, but with relief, because the truth had landed somewhere it couldn't be ignored. Graham responded with fury, of course, blaming underlings, claiming ignorance, throwing Lila under the bus in a move so predictable it was almost sad, and watching his empire start to eat itself was like watching a tower collapse from the inside. Each brick taking another with it, the media picked it up cautiously at first, then with more confidence as documents leaked, and suddenly the man who demanded the sky was grounded by his own paper trail, and I realized revenge isn't about seeing someone suffer. It's about watching a lie lose oxygen. Still, the cost lingered, the months without steady work, the strain on my savings, the way people flinched when they heard my name, and some nights I cried not because I regretted my choice, but because standing alone is lonely even when you're right. And I'd be lying if I said I never wished it had been easier. But then letters started arriving, emails from strangers who'd read the story and said, "This happened to me," or "Thank you for saying no," and I understood that what I'd done had ripples beyond my own life, and that knowledge warmed me in a way money never could. Graham's board finally forced him to step down temporarily, a phrase that fooled no one, and as he exited through the same revolving doors he'd once owned, I wasn't there to watch. But I didn't need to be, because the real victory wasn't his fall, it was my refusal to be silent. And as the investigation rolled on, deeper and wider, I prepared myself for the final chapter, knowing that consequences move slowly, but when they arrive, they change the landscape forever. And somewhere in that waiting, I found something I'd lost in years of compliance and fear, the quiet, unshakable belief that my voice mattered, and that no amount of power could ever take that from me again. When the final report dropped, it didn't arrive with drama or fanfare, just a secure PDF sent to Rachel's inbox on a quiet Tuesday morning, and yet it felt heavier than any headline, because inside it was everything I'd been told didn't matter, every log, every altered timestamp, every coerced signature, lined up and validated by people who spoke the language of consequence. And as I read the words willful negligence, abuse of authority, and retaliatory termination, my hands shook not from triumph, but from the strange grief of realizing how close I'd come to being erased by paperwork and fear. Graham was officially removed, not temporarily, not ceremonially, but permanently, his access revoked, his authority stripped, his name suddenly absent from the building he'd once ruled like a private kingdom, and the company scrambled to distance itself, issuing statements about values and new leadership, pretending this was an isolated failure instead of a culture they'd watered for years. And I watched it all from my small apartment, coffee cooling beside me, feeling the surreal calm that comes after a storm finally breaks. Leela vanished first, resigning quietly before she could be questioned under oath, and though part of me wanted to see her face consequences too, I understood that disappearance was its own kind of admission, because people who leave in silence take their guilt with them, like luggage they're afraid to open. Darius was reinstated, with apologies that sounded practiced, but he didn't stay. He told me later he'd taken a job somewhere smaller, safer, where planes mattered more than egos. And when he said, "I breathe easier now," I knew exactly what he meant. The company offered me a settlement then, a better one, without a gag order this time, framed as making things right, and I accepted not because they deserved closure, but because I did, because justice doesn't mean martyrdom, and rebuilding requires resources, and for the first time since the helipad, I allowed myself to choose peace without guilt. The money helped, yes, but what mattered more was the line in the agreement that formally cleared my name. Because reputations are currency in my world, and I'd paid too much to let mine stay tarnished by someone else's lies. Job offers followed slowly at first. Cautious calls from companies who'd watched. The case from a distance, trying to decide if I was a risk or an asset. And I learned something then, that integrity scares weak leaders and attracts strong ones. And when I finally accepted a role, it wasn't because they promised prestige, but because they promised transparency. A word that used to sound like marketing and now felt like oxygen. My first day there, no one shouted across the room. No one demanded miracles without accountability. And when I asked about safety protocols, the director smiled and said, "That's why we hired you." And I excused myself to the restroom and cried, quietly, not because I was sad, but because for the first time in years, my instincts weren't treated like a problem. Graham tried to resurface months later, of course, giving an interview that blamed cancel culture and overzealous compliance. But it fell flat, because without power, his voice was just noise. And watching him speak without an audience taught me something important. Men like him don't lose their arrogance. They lose their relevance. And that's what really punishes them. Sometimes people ask me if it was revenge, if grounding his helicopter and exposing his empire was about getting even, and I always pause before answering, because the truth is quieter than they expect. It wasn't about hurting him. It was about refusing to be sacrificed, about choosing truth over comfort, about breaking a pattern so it couldn't keep feeding on silence. Revenge stories usually end with fire and applause, but real ones end with paperwork, patience, and the slow satisfaction of watching lies suffocate when no one feeds them anymore. I still think about that night on the roof, the rain, the pilot's eyes, the way my heart hammered as I said no, and I understand now that courage isn't loud, it's steady. It's the moment you decide your life is worth more than someone else's convenience. If there's a miracle in my story, it isn't that a powerful man fell. It's that an ordinary woman stopped shrinking, and in doing so, reminded others they didn't have to either. And that knowledge stays with me every time I swipe into work, every time I speak up in a meeting, every time I hear that old voice whisper, "Stay quiet." Because now I answer it without hesitation. I already tried silence, and it almost destroyed me.
And that's the story. Thanks for watching. Take care of yourselves out there. The world is unpredictable enough.